All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar hosted by the International Solar Energy Society ISES, together with REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century. We are very pleased to have all of you here, and we are especially happy to welcome back the REN21 team for 2020. REN21 has been a great webinar partner over the years, and it is great to be able to discuss this new addition to the Global Status Reports with you today. Today's webinar will introduce us to REN21's Renewables in Cities Global Status Report for 2019 and will last 1 hour and will of course include a Q&A section for you, the audience. My name is Arabella. I am the Communications and Outreach Officer here at the ISES HQ in Freiburg, Germany, and I will give you a short introduction into ISES and the work we do, as we have many new participants joining us on the webinar today. The International Solar Energy Society ISES is a non-profit UN-accredited membership NGO. Our vision is 100% renewable energy for all, used efficiently and wisely. ISES represents a diverse membership of academics, researchers, energy practitioners, consultants, students, businesses, and advocates. ISES works together with like-minded organizations from countries all around the world to advance the renewable energy transformation. There are many benefits to joining ISES as a member, and I'm happy to introduce some of them to you. There is the exclusive access to presentations and webinar recordings, such as today's in the ISES Webinar Archive. ISES members can also get discounts and even free registrations to ISES events and partner events, and you can always find info about upcoming conferences and discounts on our website or contact us at public.relations@ises.org. Every month, ISES publishes a newsletter for our members where you can follow our progress and share your news. Members can also subscribe to our academic journal Solar Energy, our flagship publication, at a reduced price. And in the ISES online bookshop, ISES members qualify for reduced prices on the different publications. Today, there's a very special benefit to all attendees of this webinar because we are very happy to offer a special discount to you when you sign up as a member of our ISES. All attendees of this webinar will receive a 20% discount code as follow-up to this webinar over the next few days. This special offer will be valid for 2 weeks only after this webinar, so sign up quickly and join ISES and the global solar community. Additionally, ISES is happy to highlight that webinars like these are a great way to show your support by becoming a webinar sponsor. This can be especially interesting for companies and institutions working in solar, as our webinars have 500 and more registrants, and the webinars offer speaking slots as well as the opportunity to introduce your latest project or product. For any information, please do not hesitate to get in touch at public.relations@ises.org. Now, as I mentioned, my name is Arabella and I am the Communications and Outreach Officer here at the ISES office in Freiburg. I will be moderating today's webinar and I will be taking in your questions for the Q&A section afterwards. Now, some brief information on the webinar for today and especially the Q&A section before we start. As I mentioned, today during the webinar, our expert speakers will give their presentations on the REN21 Renewables in Cities Global Status Report for 2019 with a special focus on upscaling solar PV. Unfortunately, the invited speaker from the city of Sydney had to cancel at the last minute, but in his place we are very happy to welcome Duncan Gibb, who is project manager and key in producing the REN21 annual global status reports. For the Q&A section later on, we invite you to send in your questions and we are looking forward to your participation. When sending in the question, please write who the question is for and keep your questions short and precise. Please feel free to start sending in your questions anytime throughout the webinar. Now, I'm happy to introduce you to our first speaker of today, Lea Ranalder. Lea is project manager at REN21 and she coordinates the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report. Previously at REN21, Lea also worked on and co-authored reports on the status of renewable energy in South and East Africa and Latin America. Joining us as well from REN21 is speaker Duncan Gibb, and Duncan works as a project manager and analyst at REN21 with a background in renewable energy management. There he is key in producing the GSR and he focuses his work on research and analysis of renewable energy technologies. Now, I'm very happy to hand over to Lea to give us the first introduction. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Arabella, for this very kind introduction. It is my absolute pleasure to present to you today some of the key findings of the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report that we launched last November, just before the COP. For those of you who don't know REN21, we are the only global renewable energy community of actors from science, international organizations, governments, NGO, and industry. And our goal is to make this transition to renewables happen and happen now. Arabella already mentioned that the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report was, is a new addition to REN21, and we have a variety of knowledge products, the Global Status Report that I hope many of you would be familiar with, and now since last year, this new reporting series on cities, and this will also be turned into an annual publication series. In addition, we have a couple of regional reports and thematic reports, all with the goal to enable debates to really shape this transition to renewables. So the report that we launched last year on cities, as I said, is the first annual stocktake of renewable energy in cities. We have 6 chapters there, putting cities in this wider renewable energy transition, looking at the drivers for renewables in cities, the policy landscape, urban renewable energy markets, how to mobilize finance, and then as a last chapter, how to engage citizens and what cities have done to really facilitate the citizen participation. Again, as with every REN21 publication, it's not only us sitting in our dark offices producing these publications, but really a wider network of community members that have contributed to this report, either as peer reviewers, as data contributors, and also helping us to push the messages out. And in addition, we also conducted a lot of interviews. So why do we even need to talk about cities? Why is it necessary to talk about cities and renewable energy? Cities are absolutely key to advance the transition to renewables. They directly account for 2/3 of global final energy use, and also there's a significant indirect consumption that's happening in cities, such as the materials being used for buildings and products that are being shipped into cities for use there. So it's also important to talk about these indirect energy consumption. Very much linked to this high energy consumption is also the fact that cities account for 3/4 of CO2 emissions. At the same time, more than 50% of the population lives in cities, and we all know that this is going to further increase in the future due to urbanization and population growth. And cities are, of course, also financial and infrastructure hubs. So cities do offer a lever to advance the renewables in all sectors. Globally, we're making great strides in the power sector when it comes to renewables. Renewables now supply more than 1/4 of the world's electricity, but we consume more than 80% of our energy in the heating, cooling, and transport sector. And that's where renewables are lagging behind, as you can see on the slide with these little yellow squares in each of these sectors. And cities can accelerate the transition to renewables in the power sector and are also key to decarbonize heating, cooling, and transport. In the building sector, for heating and cooling, buildings account for 50% of all heating and demand, and obviously most built structures are in and around cities. For heating and cooling, energy production tends to be more localized and thus tends to occur close to the point of demand. So there's really an opportunity for the development of urban heating and cooling markets. And that's, of course, key to decarbonize the and transport. And cities can support this decarbonization efforts by shifting, for example, their fleets to renewable fuels, reducing the overall need for transport by improving walkability and bikeability of cities, and of course also promote public transport. When we're talking about renewables in cities, it's not only through the uptake of renewables, cities can have the opportunity to create more livable urban areas and healthy environments for their citizens. I always say, these drivers for renewables, they go beyond climate change, and that's a really important aspect to highlight. It's about ensuring these healthy living environments, addressing air pollution, reducing municipal energy costs, the possibility for local economic development, creating local jobs, improving the energy security, and of course also facilitating energy access where this is necessary. So this is really a variety of drivers that for cities to scale up renewables. And we see that these drivers have contributed to ambition and action at city level. There are thousands of cities that have passed renewable energy targets, both for municipal operations and for citywide operations. And in addition to that, 100% targets are gaining traction. And here I want to say not only for the power sector, but also for heating and cooling and for transport. And again, not only for municipal operations, but really for entire citywide operations. And that's very impressive. These targets tend to be higher than at the national level, and again also broader, not only targets for the power sector, but also for heating, cooling, and transport. So what I'll do now is go through these levels in a bit more detail to also line out to you what are the levers, so to say, that municipal government, that cities have to facilitate this transition. And afterwards we'll shift to the solar side of everything. So when looking at the municipal operation level, city governments can really use their role as owners and operators of municipal infrastructure. Here, they do have a significant authority to scale up renewables. How? It's important to look at both sides, at how they shift to renewable energy for their consumption and how they also become renewable energy producers. If you look at the consumption sides, we see that cities are shifting to renewables for municipal operations, by example, procuring renewable power, but also procuring bioenergy or electric vehicles for municipal fleets, and also linking electric vehicles or their electric fleets to procuring renewable power. So really linking these two together. And then also becoming active in renewable energy production. And that's a very important point, because historically we've looked at cities more as energy consumers and not so much as energy producers. So municipal governments do have this possibility of scaling up also direct renewable energy generation production. And of course here solar PV and solar thermal plays a very crucial role. That means scaling up solar PV and solar thermal on public buildings, on schools, on public housing, hospitals, shifting to solar streetlights, in addition to making use of the urban activities, so to say, using the waste and the wastewater to generate energy such as biogas and biomethane, and then feeding that back into their grids. But looking at the role that cities can play to advance the energy transition goes beyond municipal operations. And that's the city governments have a role and a mandate to advance and facilitate this transition to renewables citywide. That means really getting other urban actors on board, such as citizens, communities, businesses, places of worship, to really make this an entire citywide energy transition. How can they do this? On the one hand, using their role as regulators, so using mandates and building codes to make the integration of renewables mandatory. We have seen this typically happening for new buildings. So when new buildings are being built, whether it's a public or a private household, the integration of renewables as well as energy efficiency measures is mandatory. But some cities are also going a next step and saying, when you renovate your house, now the integration of renewable energy is mandatory. In addition to that, of course, cities have also been using specific fiscal and financial incentives to make renewable energy generation profitable and attractive. In addition, cities do play this important role for raising awareness about the benefits of renewables and really creating this dialogue at the city level for facilitating this citywide energy transition. And their city role goes beyond just their city boundaries. It goes, they have a role in pushing for renewable energies at the national level, at the global level, really being a champion and a trendsetter, pushing for high ambition, and also proving this viability of renewables. As well as we've seen that cities are very much connecting in city networks, inspiring each other, learning from each other, learning from cities worldwide, and also using this as an opportunity for a unified voice to advance renewables. Of course, I don't want to say cities are the absolute hero of the world, and cities, we only need to talk about cities when we talk about renewables. It's really important that to acknowledge that cities, of course, operate in a wider regional and national framework, and they do need the support from national governments to realize renewable energy projects. Because especially depending on where you are in the world, the city power and authority over energy issues can be limited. So sustainability and renewables, it's very a multi-level issue of having, supporting policies at national level and city level. And one big aspect here is what also impedes development at city level is, of course, these conflicting national policies, such as national fossil fuel subsidies that also trickle down to the city level and making it less profitable to shift to renewables. With that, I will now stop at this part. I'll hand over to my colleague Duncan, who is going to take a step away, so to say, from the city level, looking at, okay, what has renewables, what are the renewable energy developments at the global level, in specific at solar PV level, and then he'll bounce it back to me, and I'll go in a bit more detail about solar PV at the city level and tying it all back together.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Duncan Gibb from REN21, and thanks to Arabella for introducing me and to Lea for giving such a good introduction to our Renewables and Cities report. I think it is important to put this into context. We see, as Lea said, a lot happening on city level, but we ask ourselves, how does this all relate to the global markets of renewable energy and what is happening? So our Renewables Global Status Report, it comes out every June, more or less, annually. And we are in the midst of preparing this year's edition, so the Renewables 2020 Global Status Report. So keep in mind that the numbers we're talking about today, the market trends, are with respect to 2018. And as I'm sure many of you already know, there has been a lot of action in the renewable energy sector worldwide in 2019. So I'm going to be sharing some of these numbers that we have as they've been trickling in. But for the most part, the trends are relatively established. So we saw in 2018 that the total global capacity of renewable energy rose by 8%. And we installed what was around a record level of 181 gigawatts of renewable power. Let's put it into the context of the solar energy markets, solar photovoltaics, because we are speaking with ISES today. We saw 100 gigawatts of solar PV that was added in 2018. Some of our preliminary estimates suggest that this is even higher for 2019. So we encourage you to stay tuned for the GSR, which will come out in June. What does this all mean? Well, we know that electricity is not just power capacity. And we saw in 2018 that, taking into account that all the energy all the electricity that was produced around the world and the different roles of the technologies, that solar PV, as you can see with the smaller box for renewable electricity, now makes up around 2.4% of the total generating capacity. This is the first time that it was more than biopower we see that hydropower still is the dominant source, but wind power and solar PV are, I should say wind electricity and solar electricity from photovoltaics are quickly gaining ground on these two, on the hydropower electricity. So we also saw that there's many more countries that are installing renewable electricity. So we had 17 countries where they installed renewable energy that had capacity greater than 10 gigawatts, which was mainly solar and wind. This is excluding hydropower. And 45 countries installed more than 1 gigawatt of solar of non-hydro renewable electricity. So what's important to say is that although we have over 26% of renewable electricity worldwide, it still is not making such clear progress in gaining ground. We see energy demand rising, electricity demand rising, especially as we see, as Lea mentioned, the large amounts of energy that are used in heating and cooling sector. Some of this is becoming electrified. Electricity demand is increasing, and this makes it difficult for, even with record-setting capacity deployed in renewable electricity, for renewable energy to keep up and to keep gaining shares. It is still gaining shares, but this is slowing it down somewhat. So what does this look like per technology for the last year? As I mentioned, these are 2018 numbers. So we saw 100 gigawatts of solar PV, around half of that from wind power, a very consistent 20 gigawatts of hydropower, which has been more or less the case for the last several years. What's also important to note is that in 2018, it was the fourth consecutive year that more than 50 gigawatts of wind power was added. So we're seeing more solar PV added every year, just a little bit higher than in 2017. And as mentioned, we expect this to be even higher for 2018, or for 2019, I should say. Some estimates we've seen so far are ranging around 115 gigawatts. So we're working on finalizing these numbers for the GSR in June, and we will let you know. I'm sure we'll have a GSR webinar with Arabella sometime this summer, so you can stay tuned for that as well. So this is kind of repeating the solar story. I mean, it's been tremendous growth in the last years, and if you can imagine an even higher number in the part where 2019 will be, this is what will be to come in the coming months. We imagine this is pretty astounding, I would say, the growth of the PV market in the final years, in the previous years, and it's been also interesting to watch it on a regional level. So we've seen some of the markets, such as China, become absolutely dominant in the total installed capacity for solar PV every year. This was certainly the case in 2018, despite a market decline. We've also seen a very strong role played by the United States, by the entire EU, or Europe, we should say. We're only showing Germany in this figure, but Europe is playing continues to play a very strong role in the solar PV markets. It was originally Germany who's been more of a consistent market with some spikes and declines. We saw several years ago in 2014, Italy having a large spike for a while where it took over. And this past year, we have some of the numbers emerging from the EU already. And we're seeing that Spain is now the emerging dominant market for PV in Europe. It installed 4.7 gigawatts last year, are the first estimates. And overall, the European market actually doubled to around 16 or 17 gigawatts overall. This is compared to 8.2 in 2018. So we're seeing big growth in the European Union. In the United States, the preliminary estimates are around the same for 2018. So we're looking at 10 to 12 gigawatts. We have seen some significant market declines, however, and this is particularly relevant because of the Chinese role in the solar PV markets. China has been dominant, as you can see in the figure, in the last years. It was installed 45 gigawatts in 2018. First estimates for 2019 are saying that Chinese solar market added only 30. This has been largely due to some policy changes in the past years for China, but we'll be going into more depth on the analysis in the coming GSR. But that is obviously significant. Despite that, the global estimates are higher than the previous year. So we can see that the Chinese market has played a very strong role in the past several years, but more and more, the the solar PV capacity that is added each year is being distributed amongst different countries around the world. So we saw, I believe it is Thailand that doubled its own completely installed PV capacity last year, up to 4 gigawatts or something. Don't quote me on that, but that will be in the report. And so we're seeing this general trend where smaller countries are picking up the slack that some of the bigger markets are losing. This is largely a function of the cost just falling through the floor. Also in India, we saw a slight market decline. So India dropped by around 12% are the first estimates. So all of this just to give you a general sense for how things have been moving in the past years and in the past year of 2019. And that is what the story more or less looks like for solar PV. Again, encourage you to see the GSR in June for the latest numbers and market trends, industry trends and analysis. Lea also mentioned the importance of the heating and cooling sector on city level, and obviously it plays a big role globally as well. Solar heating and cooling used to be a very burgeoning market, as you can see from the years of 2009 to 2014, 15. It was growing rapidly every year. We've seen this market slowing quite significantly in the past years. It's growing in the last 3 or 4 years by 2% or so, 2-3%. And the overall capacity added by solar heating and cooling, I should say, is quite small these days. Again, it's similarly to the PV markets, a function of larger markets slowing down and smaller markets picking up the slack. In 2018, for example, we saw Poland, I believe the next figure here you can see, which had a market growth of tremendously 179%. And many similarly in Denmark, and some of the smaller markets, Mexico and Greece. In India, there's quite a large growth as well. But we see that the biggest markets, the ones who have historically driven the growth in solar heating and cooling, such as China, such as Turkey, actually declining. So this is a trend that we're watching very closely for 2019, and we'll be definitely reporting on the trends for solar heating and cooling in the next report. And it's very relevant as we see the incredible importance of decarbonizing not only the electricity generation, but also the heating and cooling sector. Solar heating and cooling can play a role in many contexts, not only in residential water heating, but also in commercial operations. We see the use of solar heating and cooling in many different industrial sectors, and invite you to see the GSR in 2019, in the next few months, to see what happened in 2019. So that wraps it up for me for the look on the global markets for photovoltaics, more or less, and for solar heating and cooling. And how this all relates to the city level is quite interesting for us. Cities, as Lea has already mentioned, have a different way of considering their energy consumption, much less supply oriented. So for us, it's a bit of a learning process to understand how to talk to cities about how they use renewable energy, about what it means to work with projects on renewable energy. And happy to turn it back to Lea now to talk about the urban renewable energy markets with solar energy.
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, just want to reiterate what Duncan just said. It's been a really great learning process talking about this, talking about renewable energy in cities. And again, I do want to highlight what I said in the beginning about the drivers, is to really talking about drivers that can make an impact at the local level. And that's been like air pollution, local job creation. And that's been a really interesting finding for us as well, to reiterate that renewable energy can support all of these objectives that cities have. So as Duncan said, I'll take now a bit these global perspectives and developments and bring them back to the city level. I do need to say that it is very, very difficult to differentiate between what's exactly happening at the urban level and what's not urban. So this is a bit of a, so sometimes the numbers, yeah, might include some rural numbers as well. But it is for us important to also see that there is the development of urban renewable energy markets, and that we need to showcase that stuff is happening at the city level, also to bring cities better to this energy transition. So that's a bit the goal with looking at the role of urban renewable energy markets, and now specifically at solar PV. Again, I do want to differentiate a bit between consumption and production, and as a word of caution here, and I'm happy to pick that also up a bit more in the discussion, is at city level, sometimes the differentiation between consumption and generation is not 100% crystal clear. Just because you consume renewables does not mean that you generate them locally. So that is something that we've realized when speaking to cities, speaking to city networks, that this differentiation needs to be made clear, that for actors from the energy world is of course, absolutely evident. But just as an introduction here, also to give a bit of a background on that city thinking on energy. So I want to pick up on this. We've seen that a lot of cities have these renewable energy targets, and we do also see that these targets have turned into results. These are some numbers by CDP for 2017, where they reported that more than 100 cities worldwide use at least 70% of renewable power, and that there's also 40 cities that already operate on 100% renewables. So really seeing that cities are shifting to renewables for power consumption. Again, I do want to highlight here that this, of course, very much depends on the national and on the regional mix. Of course, for a city that's located in a country where there's already a high share of renewables, it's going to be easier to report on 70% renewables. So there needs to be a critical eye on what's city-specific additions and what is already given due to the wider national context. But more interestingly, we see that cities are pushing beyond just renewables in power consumption. Renewable energy has provided this opportunity for cities and city actors to become decentralized electricity producers. And of course, solar PV has played a major role in this. Looking at distributed solar PV, in particular, building integrated solar PV, which we've seen installed on rooftops, parking areas, waste sites, and other urban spaces. Distributed solar PV is, of course, reported on less frequently than these utility scale solar PV, but these installations account for a very large share, totaling 213 gigawatts in 2018. And as I said, city and municipal governments are really becoming active here in generating renewables with their own buildings. And again, this is linking back to the drivers that I presented now several times, but it's really showcasing and highlighting this opportunity for reducing municipal energy costs and providing a backup for an unreliable grid supply and facilitating this electricity access. And I also linking it back to this role that cities have in shifting to city governments have to shifting to citywide energy transition, is that municipal governments have shown leadership. They have also played an important role in raising the awareness of renewables. One thing that I found really interesting in doing this is that city governments have used, in particular, solar PV quite strategically in installing it in public spaces, in parks, in city halls, in places where people come and people walk and people have the possibility to look and touch and feel and lose that fear of renewables. We've really seen art installations, cities putting up art installations with solar PV, and some Chinese cities replacing regular street lights and with solar street lights, specifically in these areas where it's highly visible, that are very frequented. So it's really showing this with this goal of encouraging local residents to install their own systems. And again, here highlighting this important role of city governments to have their role as policymakers, using policies and financial and fiscal incentives to facilitate this entire citywide and transition. We also do see that, in particular in solar PV, other urban actors are becoming active. So citizens, community, we see urban community energy projects popping up. So also debunking this myth that community energy is only a rural phenomena. It is also happening in cities. In particular, of course, then with a solar PV community energy projects. And again, here cities do have this possibility to provide support. For example, the city of Paris has given community energy projects some roof space to put up solar PV forming community energy groups. But we also see that businesses are taking a stand, businesses and large corporations. I mean, these are often have their activities in cities or near cities. For example, IKEA is using its large rooftops to source solar PV. By mid-2019, there were more than 900,000 solar panels installed on their roofs. And also we've seen places of worship really becoming active in this energy transition. The Vatican has invested more than 660 million for in solar PV. We've seen it also in the Philippines, in Amman, in Jordan. There are really policies to green their mosques, which have resulted in hundreds of solar PV projects. I do want to say here again that while the data situation is difficult for this distributed solar PV, I mean at global level, as Duncan also said, solar PV capacity is quite well tracked. But looking at what's happening exactly in cities with solar PV is very, very difficult, even in cities that have a municipal utility. Because not all installations are disclosed to local or national utilities. For example, in the EU, it is estimated that there are 200,000 guerilla or balcony solar installations, with 400,000 just in Germany. Because in many cities do require their residents to report installations, but of course the enforcement part here does remain challenging. I mentioned it before, this importance of looking at street lighting, but just to put a focus here again, is we do see that municipal public lighting can account for up to 40% of a municipal electricity budget. So of course the incentive here to shift on the one hand to more energy efficiency, but also to solar street lighting is of course high. We have seen that under the Global Covenant of Mayors, there were now 6,300 action plans submitted, and more than 90% include a reference to energy efficient street lighting and renewables for street lighting. So that really shows that this is very high up on a city government agenda. We've seen that the sales of solar powered street lighting reached 3.8 million cumulatively in 2017, and more than half of that was in Asia and the Pacific. So really highlighting this important role that solar street lighting can play at the city level. Jumping to solar thermal markets, again, as Duncan also mentioned, the global data on urban renewable heat capacity is really lacking. It's very, very difficult to get that data, but I can present you some examples of solar thermal projects that are being undertaken by city governments, really showcasing this important role that they can provide, that they have for providing low temperature heat for water and space heating. For example, Kiev, in Kiev in the Ukraine, the city government has installed solar water heaters at 28 preschools and nurseries. We've seen that in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, which is like Brazil's solar city. There are more than 3,500 solar water heating systems installed by 2017, and of course continuously being added afterwards. Again, cities can facilitate this use through building codes. One really interesting example here is Barcelona in Spain, which became the first city to require the use of solar thermal energy in all new buildings. And this is actually something that has then become a national mandate. So that's is a really good example of how a city action can turn into national action. And then as well, Barcelona has inspired other cities to also take action and become active. And of course, also looking at the opportunity for solar thermal systems in district heating. We've seen that in district heating, biomass is still the major source of renewable energy. We see that geothermal is increasing, but also solar thermal is providing an entry point and an opportunity, where we see 339 large-scale systems, with the majority of them in Europe, but also happening outside of Europe. So just to tie this all together, in conclusion, we can say that this nature of renewable energy empowers cities to become key players in the energy transition. Renewables offer cities this opportunity to achieve a wide range of objectives. So also talking about air pollution, economic growth, energy access, and so on. Of course, everything while saving the climate. Cities do have these various roles, and are important to advance renewables in all end-use sectors. There is a need to strengthen the data on renewable energy in cities, something that I've repeatedly said now during this presentation. Really, it's important that we know what's happening in cities to inform decision makers, to change this historic perception that cities are only energy consumers, to bridge the cities and energy debates, to track the advancement that's happening, and then aligning the policies across the national, subnational, and local level. Everything with the aim of empowering cities, increasing their awareness of their role in the energy transition, to ultimately bring cities more to the energy debate, but also this energy debate more to cities. So that's it from our side. And yeah, really looking forward to all of your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Lea and Duncan. And we're going to go right away and head into the Q&A session. And the first question we had several times is, from your 2019 report, what are the who are the outstanding, who are the role model cities you've come across in terms of renewable energy integration? So, who are the ones with the best examples we can then take lead from?
I mean, to be very honest with you, I'm always a bit worried. I don't always want to put out the usual suspects, the Copenhagen, the Heidelberg, the Paris. I mean, we can point these out, and they're doing fantastic work, but there are also a lot of other cities around the world that are doing really great stuff. One interesting example is Seoul, the city of Seoul, where we've now seen they've launched this massive plan to really scale up solar PV. And what's interesting there is they're building on their citizens to make this happen. I think they've now, in the last couple of years, had already 20,000 in solar PV installations in the cities done by citizens. So I think that's really interesting. I also want to highlight the city of Cape Town, which has actually sued the national government because they wanted to procure their own renewable electricity and were not able to do so. And just the news were out, I think, a couple of weeks ago that they've won. And this is, I'm really interested to see how this is going to change the landscape in South Africa and also in the wider sub-Saharan region, that they're now able to procure their own renewable electricity. And that was really their goal. They sued the national government because they wanted to procure renewable electricity. So again, many great examples from around the world. Of course, also in the United States, there are many cities that have 100% renewables. Maybe from Latin America, one example that I find really interesting is Santiago de Chile, that has coupled their metro system with procuring renewable electricity. So I think just this sector coupling and system integration is a really important point to highlight, because often when we talk, as Duncan and everybody here at REN21 will know, we talk about electric vehicles, but we never ask the question, where does the energy come from? Where does the electricity come from? So this is also for me a really interesting example to highlight.
Okay, thank you for letting us know about a few of the extraordinary examples besides the one that most of us already know about. We had another question that goes into the realm of rural areas that are now transitioning into being or into becoming cities, because when we think about a city, we often think about these like Stone Age old cities with old houses, maybe as we know them, for example, in Europe. But obviously in many parts of the world, we see rural areas that are now becoming cities. Have you any experience with those, like with this very specific kind of a city, and what would their renewable energy strategies look like, or are there any examples you can recall right away?
To be honest with you, here I'm going to do some promotion for our next edition, because this is something that has repeatedly come up while we produce this report. Is, I mean, first of all, how do you define a city? What's a city boundary? Do we not also need to speak about the city, the urban-rural continuum that's happening? And then where the self-promotion comes in is that for the 2020 edition, we will have a focus on sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically on these cities that are transitioning, from more rural to urban areas, on the informal settlements in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is maybe a lack of really formal governance structure. So I unfortunately have to say, stay tuned for in about a year, and I hope I can answer that question then in a bit more detail.
All right, thank you. We also had another question coming in that plays into the financial part of cities transitioning towards renewable energies. And as you mentioned, for example, there's a big, let's say, gray number of guerrilla solar installations across Europe, which then obviously is not really covered by the local city, and the local city might not make money out of this. So can you maybe evolve a bit on the question of finance and renewables for a city?
Absolutely. I think this is always, I mean, big learning for also for me and for us during this last year. I mean, financing renewable energy projects in cities, that's where really, I mean, that's the thing that we need to speak about. Because often, I mean, how is a city going to finance this massive project that needs immense investments? So of course, that's always the killer question. And here I want to, take a step back and on the one hand, highlight the fact that there are many, like, private investment into cities remains a bit difficult because also of the lack of data, that some cities have very poor data of exactly, their energy consumption, exactly what's happening in their cities. So that means there's not really this exact measure of what's happening. Of course, then with a lack of a vision, a master plan, and so on. So that, of course, impedes investment. But also, a really interesting and important part is that many city governments do not have the ability to borrow money on their national markets, and I mean, forget speaking about getting money on international markets. So again, there is a need to develop systems of how cities can finance these projects. There have been the role of development banks and has been large here in getting, also helping cities in the capacity building, getting this first bankable projects in. Of course, and then with that first bankable project, making it easier to get a private investment also rolling in. And also the role, of course, of national governments in supporting city governments with their loans. And again, this is, I don't want to generalize. There are, of course, cities that have, a very large tax base that can finance these projects more easily, but we see really huge differences between cities and the amount of money that they have available per resident, and in particular for these specific renewable energy projects.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to come back to something you kind of mentioned earlier on already, and that is the sometimes contradictory nature of cities' policies on renewables, but then also the national policy on renewables. And you mentioned the example of South Africa, where a city had to basically sue to be allowed to have renewable energy for themselves or to be able to use it. So what's your finding on the contradiction between federal, national, and also city policies in line to renewable energy?
I mean, this is something that we will, again, a bit of self-promotion that we will look into more detail in the next edition, and really lining up the national and the city level policies. I do want to say though, and these, I mean, just as a case study example is, I was talking to the city and to the mayor of Glasgow, and she was saying, okay, so now Scotland has this amazing zero emission net zero policy until, I think, what was it, 2040. It's like, well, but they're never going to achieve this without us. I mean, Glasgow consumes, is responsible for 2/3 of all emissions. How are they gonna, they need us to achieve this goal. Do you think anybody has ever contacted us? And this is something that seems so self-evident, but isn't. In many parts of the world where this communication, just the normal basic communication between different levels of governance is lacking, and just getting the relevant stakeholders in the room and developing plans how city governments can support national targets, how national governments can support city targets, and vice versa. So I think, yeah, that's maybe not answering your question 100%, but hopefully, again, stay tuned for the 2020 edition.
Okay, thank you. So there will be 2 more questions because we are receiving so many questions, but we have so little time today. And one goes out to Duncan, and it is a bit more specific to the general GSR report. One of our listeners, he noted that the part for hydropower can be very different in countries, and in particular, the listener noted a huge difference in the uptake of hydropower between countries like Germany and then in comparison, for example, to Spain and Turkey. So I know that is a rather specific question for the general GSR, but Duncan, do you have any quick input maybe on why or how come that this is the case?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And as it relates to the specific case of Germany with hydropower, I can't say I'm super informed about what is holding back specifically hydropower potential in Germany. It's a country that is not really featuring in our hydropower section. As it turns out, when we track the hydropower markets and the hydropower industries, we do it based on which countries are adding the most capacity, and then we go into details about what is driving these capacity additions. So we're not really looking into countries that are perhaps not adding capacity and trying to figure out the specific drivers for that. What I can say is that it could be related to the overall resource potential, but particular to the German case, I'm not really informed on that. As it relates to other countries, though, that you mentioned, which have seen higher uptake of hydropower capacity, in many cases they have, let's say, looser regulations in terms of environmental protection, or what sort of sites can be turned into electricity generating stations, what can be done with, if a site can be dammed or not, which kind of protection measures have to be in place, and that just enables a higher potential for projects. We were speaking to a colleague from Brazil last week about the GSR, and he was saying that around 3/4 or 80% of the remaining undeveloped hydropower capacity in Brazil is in environmentally protected areas. So this is still a policy that plays a large role in the ultimate resource potential of hydropower. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. But if anybody wants more specific information, or to open up a dialogue about these certain reasons for market developments related to a certain technology, just please feel free to send me an email.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to stay tuned for the next GSR to hopefully learn more and see a new chapter on the hydropower question. And then coming back to the city topic with our last question, we discussed quite a bit the role of relevant stakeholders in the process of cities going towards renewable energies. And I think one of the relevant stakeholders, or maybe the most relevant of all of them, we haven't really touched up on. And Lea, I'd like to ask you, how do you see citizen engagement in the process of cities going to renewable energies, and how can cities ensure that their citizens actually do want to take the same step, and how can citizens support that transition?
No, thank you, Arabella. That's a brilliant question. For me, this is where I see cities or city governments have a really important role in this transition. First of all, because they're much closer to their citizens in that sense, can engage with them more closely. And we do have a specific chapter on citizen participation, so I invite all of you to check that out. What we've seen just briefly is that citizens have become, of course, shifted to renewables for their own consumption, not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. We've seen that citizens also become prosumers, again, facilitated often through specific city-level policies and fiscal and financial incentives that exist at the city level. For example, in this example of Seoul, where they have a specific policy for having citizens become prosumers and for community energy projects. And we also do see citizens forming community energy projects in their own, in the urban environment. And what I also want to say is we've seen that cities have used these participatory governance tools at the city level for their energy projects. And I think that's something that's really important to highlight, because if we want to make the energy transition happen, we need citizen support. Otherwise, in a couple of years, if there's no just and inclusive transition, we will not get there. We really need to make sure that we also address this topic of how can we get everybody involved and make sure that everybody profits from this. So participatory governance tools, getting people into the room to discuss energy projects. There are some cities that have a participatory budget and specifically on energy projects. And also, of course, this entire topic of citizen support for projects here, and this trend of remunicipalization, in particularly in Europe, and there particularly again in Germany, where we've seen that citizens have pushed to remunicipalize their utilities, their city municipal utilities. And here, the shift to renewables has been a real driver. Hamburg is a great example, where there has been the support, this shift and pressure from the citizens. And again, of course, we also need to acknowledge that there has been, pushback against renewable energy projects also in cities. So addressing this entire not in my backyard issue, where again, participatory governance, where again, citizen participation tools are really important to raise these awareness of the benefits of renewables.
All right, thank you. So maybe 2 closing words from each of you, and then I'm going to take over for a few closing remarks from our side as well.
2 closing words.
Yes, maybe 3.
Renewables now. I think we're very excited about the work we're doing on cities. We see the cities work and the global status report work as incredibly complementary. And as REN21, what we're really working to do is help the people who are so interested in renewable energy in general, in the global status of it, in the projects and the technologies, connect with the people who are actually using energy. And as Lea mentioned at the start, we have a huge urbanization rate. We have 2/3 of our energy use that's in cities now. 3/4 of our CO2 emissions. The cities need renewables, and we're trying to play this role that helps the renewable people communicate with the cities, and the cities people communicate with the renewable people. So we're open to talk to anybody about anything. So just reach out to us and let us know what your case is and how we might work together.
Yeah, now Duncan took away all the other
sorry.
great things that I wanted to say. No, I think it's data. For me, speaking about data and the lack of data is really important. We need to address this. We need to be better in tracking what's happening at city level to really make them also, to help them to become global energy players, and again, bringing this energy transition also to cities to showcase the possibilities and opportunities that renewables can provide for the urban area.
Okay, thank you to our two speakers. Thank you very, very much for coming on and for presenting the report. And thank you to our audience for sharing your questions. And I hope you all enjoyed the webinar quite a lot. I certainly did. And before we all head out to our busy days and maybe to our friends down in Australia into your well-deserved good night now, I want to highlight a few more of the things that ISES has lined up for the coming weeks. And the first one is the next upcoming ISES webinar. We will have one in early March, where we will introduce the latest set of the ISES infographics, which covers the topic of solar thermal heat for industry processes. There we took a closer look on the many possibilities that are already available for renewable energies and specifically for solar thermal heat to help in the production of everyday usage goods, so drinks and medicine and technology. And we will introduce those infographics to you, and we will have speakers from Chile, Jordan, and Germany. So again, a very international board of speakers. And this is going to be at the beginning of March, and more information about this is coming out soon, and you will probably all receive an email invitation, and we are looking forward to having you on that webinar again as well. And then something else that's going on for ISES and the global solar community this year is our next academic conference, that is Eurosun 2020. That is the 13th International Conference for Solar Energy for Buildings and Industry. And again, buildings and cities tie in very well with solar energy and renewable energy, as we just heard in that great report. The conference is going to take place from the 1st to the 4th of September 2020 in Athens, in Greece. And for this conference, we have a call for abstracts that's open. So if you are working on anything solar energy related that could fit one of our 13, I think we cover topics in the conference, submit your abstract, and the deadline for that is the 31st of March. And in addition to that, we have for the very first time a very special call for keynote speaker proposals. We really want to open up our conferences to have a very diverse and wide-ranging set of speakers. And so we invite you, if you are a speaker, or if you have a great suggestion for somebody who could really give a great talk, write to us. We have a call for keynote speaker proposals, and the deadline for that as well is the 31st of March this year. And you can learn more about this conference at the homepage eurosun2020.org. And then finally, about this webinar, thank you very much for coming on and for joining us on the webinar, to both, again, the speakers and the audience. The webinar recording will be available on the ISES homepage in a few days, and you will get a follow-up email. Again, also please remember, in that follow-up email, you will see your 20% discount on joining ISES as a member. So I would definitely keep my eyes open for that. And we always look forward to your feedback on our webinars as well, because obviously we want to develop them further and further and make them as much to your liking as possible. So we have a survey that's coming with that email as well, and we invite you to send in your answers to that survey. And of course, ISES can be reached online in many, many different places. So please reach out to us. And then once again, thank you for joining us today. And we are now closing the webinar, and have a good day, have a good night, and see all of you soon. Bye-bye.